Here in a world where all hope seems lost, greater is He who resides in us. God, we stand unshaken.
Hey, welcome to this week's sermon preview. I'm here with Pastor Nick. We've been going through our Unshaken series in the book of 1 Thessalonians. So Nick, kind of give us a recap of where we've been and what we're looking at this week.
Yeah, thanks, Lance. So this week we are going to be focusing on chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. So Jared did a wonderful job with the first part of chapter 4, and so we're going to finish off the last part of chapter 4. And this is a really interesting passage because Paul moves into several verses here talking about the second coming of Jesus. Okay, which I know for a lot of people, talking about the second coming, end times, all that stuff can bring up some anxiety and can bring up uncertainty and fear even. And so to the very start, I want to actually visit verse 18, which is our last verse in this passage that talks about these words are meant to encourage you. That's my translation of it. I don't have it memorized, but these words are here to encourage you, right? So for you, that when it comes to the second coming of Jesus or the end times, there is hope and words of encouragement, not fear. And so that's the first thing that I want to mention. But so as we look through this passage, we see that Paul's trying to encourage them, but there is clearly something that the Thessalonians are missing, right? They're not understanding. So Lance, tell us a little bit, what is the scenario? What is happening here that Paul is addressing?
Yeah, so Paul really wasn't with the Thessalonians for more than a few weeks.
Right.
And so they're kind of worried about, Jesus' second coming and the people that have died in this time. Did they miss it? What's really going on?
Yeah.
There's kind of this confusion because Paul says, hey, Jesus is returning soon. They don't really know what that window really is.
Right. Paul says Jesus is coming, and they think it's like for sure in their lifetime.
Yeah.
Like they think for sure it's going to be while we're alive, and then somebody dies, and they're like, well, what about Aunt Susie? She just died. Does she miss this wonderful second coming of Jesus? So within that, they don't know how to grieve.
Yeah.
Right? Because the passage talks about to not grieve like those in the world who do not have any hope.
Yeah.
Right? So Lance, as we think about this, we've got Paul's kind of talking about how believers, followers of Jesus, grieve in one way, and those that are not followers of Jesus grieve in another way. What do those look like? What's the difference between those?
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone's going to grieve kind of the same way. As there's going to be this pain, this sorrow, this hurt that's happening. But we as believers in Christ can also be at one of our lowest and darkest points at the same time knowing we have this hope in Jesus, and that, no matter what loss has happened in our lives, in eternity, we're going to see those people again. And we have this hope in Jesus that's going to be taking care of that pain and sorrow. It's never going to go away, but there's this bigger hope that outweighs that sorrow that's happening.
So the difference between followers of Jesus grieving and the world grieving is that followers of Jesus, their grief is coupled with hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that it's significant. I mean, that
Absolutely.
makes a big difference in the grief that we feel. The grief is the same, but the hope coming in that is sprinkled in with that gives a different perspective and a different approach even to a loved one passing away, because we know they will not miss the second coming.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a lot within this passage and different directions that we'll head in the sermon. But for the most part, just broad strokes in this passage, the big idea that we see is that Paul is pointing out a promise from Jesus or from God. He's pointing out this promise that Jesus is bringing, and this is a promise for the future.
Yep.
And that future promise should encourage us and enable us to live with hope and faithfulness here today.
Absolutely.
That's the biggest thing. There's lots of anxieties, and there's even different interpretations into what Jesus' second coming will look like, or what the end times will look like. So many different views on that. And realistically, a lot of that doesn't matter fully. I say that cautiously. It doesn't matter fully because no matter what interpretation you have of the scriptures in Jesus' second coming or in the end times, there's the promise of the second coming, and that promise gives us hope
Absolutely.
and faith for today. And that's the biggest thing.
Yep.
So as you're looking at this passage and preparing for this week, I would take a second to read it, a couple different translations. It's always helpful to do that. And then think about how does this passage give you hope? How does this passage maybe draw you closer in your walk with Jesus for today?
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. We'll see you then.
See ya.
Nothing to fear in the battlefield. God is our hope.